cold enough in here for you? Gained 1 degree so far. I'm surprised you aren't shivering, because a short sleeve shirt and all that.
No, I love the cold.
Oh, okay. So like changing jackets and putting my warm jacket on instead of this one. Outstanding, it's working. Good morning. Well, it's 11 o'clock, so I think we might as well get started. We'd worked our way through most of the steps that I listed in the 10 steps of the Civil War. Take a look at those really fast, and then we're going to get up and into the war and talk about the first couple of years of the war. Of course, the first step was the Wilmot Proviso that was passed suggesting no slavery in the new territories captured from Mexico back in 1846, but it didn't sell very well. We talked about things like popular sovereignty, Alabama Platform, etc. Zach Taylor got elected. The second step would be the Compromise of 1850, which was kind of started out by Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster, but Stephen A. Douglas was the guy that figured out how to get it passed in the final form. Mission of California.
Mr. Hunt, you've muted yourself.
Territory, but there was this problem with polygamy that a lot of people in America didn't like, and that's going to hold Utah back from becoming a state until much, much later, long after the Civil War is over with. We talked about how much the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was part of that compromise, angered the people of the North, caused violence up there. There's little Stephen A. Douglas. Step 3 was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, where the Beecher family upset the South because of the portrayal of life in the South. Even though it never purported to be the truth, it was a novel, but nevertheless, we got into the election of 1852, some new parties, the American Party, otherwise known as the Know Nothings. Then we moved up to the presidency of Franklin Pierce, and we got to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which does away with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, does away with the notion that any law could restrict slavery in a territory that wasn't a state yet, and it splits Kansas territory into two pieces. The smaller piece will become the state of Kansas. It also started a lot of fighting that we call Bleeding Kansas, and that's going to last all the way through another presidency. Talked about John Brown's role in the Potawatomi Massacre and other issues like that. And we talked about Henry Ward Beecher, the northern preacher who sent, or paid to have sent, Sharp's rifles down there, and they started calling those Beecher's Bibles. There's the Beecher family again. You can go back and look at the chronology of Bleeding Kansas. The Republican Party comes into life in 1854. Kansas keeps trying to submit constitutions. It finally will get a constitution approved in 1859, and it will become a state at the beginning of 1861. Step 5 was the caning of Charles Sumner, violence on the floor of the United States Congress, which showed how serious things were becoming. The election of 1856, which brings pro-slave James Buchanan of Pennsylvania into office. And while he was president, of course, we'll have the step 6, the Dred Scott decision, which once again, first of all, Dred Scott's going to lose this, although he and his owner were doing it to bring slavery into the court. And the Supreme Court will come out and say that, first of all, if your skin's not white, you have no standing before the court because you're not a citizen. Even if you're a free man, you're still not a citizen. It also says that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional, which doesn't really make sense since it's already been repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Go figure. But it made people in the North angry because the Supreme Court seemed to be pro-slavery, pro-South. Roger B. Taney was the Chief Justice of the United States, appointed by Andrew Jackson. We talked about that. Step 7 was the Panic of 1857, caused by the fact that we had too much gold. That sounds hard to be, have a panic about. But what happened was, because we had too much gold in circulation, it lowered the value of gold. The old rule about you only want it because you haven't got it. If you've got too much of it, you don't want it anymore. The North is going to be resentful of this, particularly resentful of the South, because this panic didn't hurt the South. They didn't have many banks, and they didn't have industry or anything like that, but they did have cotton fields, which were still there, and they still had slaves. So the North's getting even more resentful. Abraham Lincoln's getting ready to run for Senate against Stephen A. Douglas. One of his early speeches in 1858 was "A House Divided," and basically he said that this country cannot continue with one half of the country free, one half of the country slave state, and so one way or another, either it's going to be all free or all slave state. He was right there. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, step number 8, that's where Lincoln nailed Douglas kind of to the wall in a debate by saying, how can you both say you support the Dred Scott decision and yet you also support popular sovereignty, when the Dred Scott decision said you can't forbid slavery. Step number 9 was John Brown's raid on the Harper's Ferry, attempting to start a Southern slave rebellion, and his subsequent conviction and execution. I mentioned the Secret Six, the guys that I can't help but hear myself talking in the background there. This used to be a set of slides that were narrated. The Secret Six were the people that bankrolled John Brown. They were afraid they were going to go to jail. Finally, the 10th step will be the election of 1860. The Republican convention, after some contest between Lincoln and others, he's going to come out on top. Hannibal Hamlin will be his vice presidential candidate. The Democratic convention is going to split the Democratic Party between pro-slavery and pro-popular sovereignty. Stephen A. Douglas will be one candidate. John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky will be the other candidate. And of course, Lincoln's going to win. So we're into the war. Now, a lot of people realized almost as soon as Lincoln won, it was in December, South Carolina is going to vote to secede from the Union. Remember, South Carolina is the state that pushed things like nullification and that sort of stuff, and they're still kind of leading in this notion of states' rights. So they secede, and a fellow by the name of John Crittenden is a senator from Kentucky. He's going to try and come up with a compromise bill that the Congress will pass, guaranteeing that the South will be able to keep having their slavery and some other things, but it just didn't get through Congress. That's in December of 1860. They're going to have one more try to stop this process. But by February, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas will all have seceded by the first day of February. They're going to form a country that they call the Confederate States of America. They're going to have their own flag, and although there was a lot of debate about what the flag was going to be, they're going to set up their capital in Montgomery, Alabama, and it will stay that way for a while. In the meantime, we're going to have our first outbreak of war. There's the second effort, by the way, on the 2nd of March, 2 days before Lincoln becomes president. The Corwin Amendment to the Constitution. It's going to get all the way through Congress. It's going to go out to the states for ratification, but they won't ratify it. So the war is on, for all intents and purposes. We talked about, or we haven't talked about, if you want to look at that chart in your own time, basically what it said was that it's impossible for the South to win this war, because it shows that the North has all the resources, with 2 exceptions. Often skip over one of them. One of them is people in military service between 18 and 60. The South has more at the time. They have more senior officers who went to West Point at the time. That's an advantage. The only other advantage they have is cotton, but you can't eat it, you can't shoot it, and the Union had a navy to blockade all the ports, so you can't sell it either. Vocabulary, we'll talk about this one at a time. Let's just talk about habeas corpus. That's a procedure by which, if you're arrested, your lawyer can present himself before a magistrate and file a writ of habeas corpus, and the arresting authority is forced to do 2 things. It has to bring you out so the court can see you, and it has to show the formal charges that have been leveled against you. If it can't show the formal charges leveled against you, they have to let you go. That's habeas corpus. During the war, Abraham Lincoln has trouble with people who are loyal to the South, but they're living up north, causing trouble for him. So he suspends habeas corpus and throws them in jail and kind of throws the key away. With habeas corpus, they could have all got out again. We'll talk about the others later. That's Lincoln's cabinet, got it memorized. Moving right on, the Confederate States of America. Oh, you can hear the music in the background. I didn't think it was working. It doesn't work on Ultra. That's the Bonnie Blue Flag, which was a Southern song. I've got a lot of Northern songs too. President Jefferson Davis, Vice President Alexander Stephens. Look at all those other members of the cabinet. They're going to have a high turnover rate because of the progress of the war. That's Jefferson Davis on the left. He used to be Secretary of War. Around the time of the Mexican-American War, he was Secretary of War. And Alexander Stephens is on the right. He will later become governor of Georgia. I've kind of put this out of order because people always tend to. This is the first man that Jefferson Davis appointed to be a general in the Southern Army. There was no Southern Army, but this guy is going to become a major general. And he will be organizing the militia of the state of South Carolina for the Battle of Fort Sumter. We'll talk about Fort Sumter in a sec. Of course, the most famous of the Southern generals, Robert E. Lee, will be very, very deeply conflicted on whether to stay in the Union Army. He was promised the rank of general and control of Union forces. He was deeply conflicted. He went to people that he respected and asked for their advice, and basically everyone said, that's up to you, buddy. And he decided to remain loyal to his home state. Albert Sidney Johnson, arguably the best of the Southern generals, but he's killed early on in the war. He had the most experience. Thomas J. Jackson was relative unknown until the first Battle of Bull Run, at which he will be a hero, and he's going to get promoted fairly quickly after that. He will be kind of the right arm of Robert E. Lee when Robert E. Lee assumes command of the Army of Northern Virginia. He'll be killed in the war. James Longstreet from Tennessee didn't even have slaves, didn't believe in slavery, but he was loyal to his home state. Joseph E. Johnston was another fairly experienced military officer. He will be in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia for a while. And before the Army of Northern Virginia even exists, he'll be in charge of the Army of the Shenandoah for a while. Right as soon as they have an army. There's Fort Sumter. Let's take a look at Fort Sumter. Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Sumter's in the middle of the water there. There were a lot of federal outposts. Remember during the nullification crisis that Andrew Jackson was warned that the state would try and take over some of the federal outposts, like their armory, where they had all their ammunition and weapons, and some of the forts. The general, well, there was no general in charge down there. There was a major in the federal army. I'll start calling the Union Army. I'll start calling the Southerners the Confederate Army to make it easier. There's a major by the name of Anderson, and he was pretty well known, and he was considered calm and reliable and not a guy likely to get flustered. But what he's going to do is he's going to move all of his people. He didn't have that many. He had maybe 90 or less. He's going to concentrate them all in one little fort in the middle of Charleston Harbor, which was probably the best fort that the Union had there. In the days before Lincoln became president, after he'd been elected, but before he became president, the Union tried to resupply Fort Sumter because they were somewhat isolated, and the South stopped selling them supplies and food. They were unable to do that because the first general that Jefferson Davis appointed, General Beauregard, captured all the outlying posts that the Union had abandoned, took their artillery, aimed them all at Fort Sumter from the north and from the south, and also aimed them out to sea, so that the Union tried to bring a steamer, a paddle wheeler, in to resupply Fort Sumter, and they couldn't. Plus they'd be sunk by the artillery. When Abraham Lincoln comes into office, he also tries to resupply Fort Sumter. He tells the governor of South Carolina he refused to recognize the Confederate States of America, so he sent a message to the governor of South Carolina saying, "I'm just sending food, no more soldiers, no ammo, nothing like that. Please let me through." And the governor of South Carolina, of course, wouldn't. And he asked Beauregard he was afraid that the Union Army they were starting to recruit more and more soldiers. He was afraid that if he waited longer that Fort Sumter would be reinforced. So he asked General Beauregard to reduce the fort. In other words, to take out the fort. And that's going to happen in between the 12th and 13th of April. It's very interesting. General Beauregard became a general because of the war, and he wasn't a general before the war. He was a military officer. And the major who ran that fort was his artillery instructor when he was going to school. But he sent a note out and said, "Why don't you give up? You don't stand a chance of holding that fort." Of course, the major said, I'll consider that if I get orders from above," which wasn't satisfactory to Beauregard or to the governor of South Carolina. So on the 12th of April, he's going to open fire. It's going to be a very gradual fire because even though it was at a long distance, they were surrounded on all sides. And they even had one floating battery. I don't know how they did that, but a giant raft or something, and they had artillery on it. And they started gradually, very methodically, shooting mortars and things like that into the fort. And they did that throughout the day. They slowed down a little at night, but about once every hour, they'd fire something else into the fort. And basically, the Major Anderson, who was commanding the fort, ran out of ammunition, and a negotiator went into the fort to talk to him and came back out, and there was some confusion on who had the authority to negotiate, but eventually the agreement's going to be made that Anderson will be allowed to evacuate the fort, which he did on the 13th of April. So we've totally lost control. The Union has totally lost control of Charleston Harbor. Now the Union quickly starts to blockade all the other ports. But they're not going to be able to get into Charleston Harbor. They're going to have to sit off pretty far out at sea. There's Beauregard, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. He's from Louisiana. That's easy to figure with that name. As soon as that's over, Abraham Lincoln's going to call for 42,000 volunteers for a 3-month session. Enlistment for 3 months. Pretty quickly he's going to realize that's not going to work, and he's going to call for 72,000 volunteers for a 3-year period of enlistment. Probably because of the fight at Fort Sumter and his call-up of troops, in April and May, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina are all going to join the Confederacy. When they do that, the Confederacy moves its capital from Montgomery, Alabama, up to Richmond, Virginia, which is 90 miles south of the capital of the Union, Washington, D.C. That's interesting. That area will be kind of the eastern theater of the war. Most of the seaports in the Confederacy are blockaded by the Union. The Union will actually capture some of the seaports and just hold on to them, trying to keep the South from being able to sell cotton or buy supplies. So now we've got 11 states out. The Confederacy considered that Missouri belonged to them too, but it was almost true, but not quite. Missouri didn't leave the Union. South had sympathy from Europe's ruling class. They could fight a defensive war, but the North had to invade. The North had to win. A tie would go to the South. The South felt they had the initial moral and morale advantages because they were the ones being attacked. Although Fort Sumter was kind of an attack. And they initially had more West Point graduates leading their militias in their combined army. And they had an all-volunteer army. The only problem with that is that the South was very much states' rights, and getting them all together to agree to one policy or another was like herding cats. Jefferson Davis wasn't a particularly good leader, and their volunteer militia, an army, thought, well, I volunteered my way into this, I can volunteer my way out of this too. So I had a little trouble with that. And the only superiority they had was cotton. If you can't sell it, you can't get any money for it, it's worthless to you. So what are they going to do? They're just going to try and hold out until the North gets politically tired of fighting the war. Maybe they can do things to discourage the people in the North. They're going to try and negotiate their way out of the war. And they're going to try and get the European countries to recognize them as an independent country and help them negotiate the end of the war. They felt closer to the European countries than the remainder of the Union did. So that's their strategy. Northern advantages were just about everything. They controlled the seas, they had a strong banking system, better railroad system, could purchase supplies abroad wherever they wanted, had money, had manpower, and their manpower was forever increasing because they got most of the immigrants from Germany and Ireland and places like that. They came pouring into the country. And if you don't have a job, what the heck, join the army. So there were a lot of Irishmen in the Union Army. Northern strategy different from the Southern strategy. They were taking advantage of their superiority at sea. They were going to use naval blockades to blockade all the southern ports. They were going to use the Navy to get control of the Mississippi, thereby cutting off the western part of the Confederacy. They were going to subdivide the South, and they were going to capture the city of Richmond, which looked like an easy job because it's only 90 miles south of Washington, D.C. Both sides had a very unrealistic outlook concerning this war. Lincoln didn't yet believe that he couldn't resolve the war pretty quickly. The South felt all they had to do was give the North a bloody nose and the North would quit. The first major battle was going to take, by the way, there's the author of the Northern Strategy. They called the Northern Strategy the Anaconda Plan. The idea of squeezing the South into submission. Winfield Scott, they started calling him Old Fuss and Feathers. He was pretty heavyweight. He was kind of physically feeble by this stage of the game. He's an old man. He's going to die in a year or so. But his strategy, the strategy will work. And that's the strategy that the North will follow to win the Civil War. So, if I divide this war up, I can divide it into kind of two main parts. One is in the east, mainly focused in between the two capitals, between Washington, D.C. and Richmond. Most of it's fought in Virginia, although some is fought, well, it's still Virginia, but in the western part of Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley and places like that, where people were trying to go around Washington, D.C. The Western Theater was along the Mississippi River and all the tributaries of the Mississippi. So the Union will launch their attacks on the South from up near Cairo, Illinois, and move southward, or try to move southward. We called the Union Army up around Washington, D.C., the Army of the Potomac, and the Southern Army became called the Army of Northern Virginia. That wasn't their official name at the beginning, but it was a good descriptive name, so that's what it started being called. Initially, well, we'll talk about initially who's running what. The first big battle is in July 1861. It's called the Battle of Bull Run by the north. By the south, it's called the Battle of Manassas. During the Civil War, the Union tended to name battles by landmarks that were near the battlefield. If there's a river there, if there's a stream, if there's a hill, whatever. The South tended to name their battles after the closest village or little city that was nearby. Manassas, Virginia, about I don't know, as the crow flies, somewhere in between 28 and 31 miles southwest or south-southwest of Washington, D.C. So to get there, you just cross the Potomac and go more or less south. The actual fight was on a stream. Since it was an all-year stream, the nickname or the name they used for that was a run, and that was Bull Run. It's a tributary that runs into the Potomac River. I know that country pretty well because I was born in Quantico on the Marine base, which wasn't far from there. And at another time, I ended up having to register for the draft during the Vietnam War up in Manassas. By the way, the people of Manassas were kind enough to put me at the top of the list because I wasn't one of their neighbors. That's how draft boards work. At any rate, Beauregard was going to be the senior general in charge of this battle, and a fellow by the name of McDowell will be the senior general in charge of the Union forces. Beauregard is listed as having 22,000 men. McDowell is listed as having 35,000. Out west, Jefferson Davis has already appointed a whole bunch of new generals. And up in the direction of Winchester, somewhere out that way, north and west of the Shenandoah River, there'll be General Albert Johnson, I think his name is. What the heck is it? Will be in charge of the southern troops. He's got about 12,000 men, and a general by the name of Patterson's got 18,000. Now, I got to tell you the truth about the Battle of Bull Run. Both sides weren't ready for war yet. Their men weren't trained. And so, in reality, although I quoted 35,000 against 22,000 or whatever, in reality, in the whole Battle of Bull Run, there were probably 18,000 men on each side who were actually involved in the fighting. Early on in the battle, and both sides thought this battle would end the war. Well, a lot of people did. In fact, when McDowell starts moving his men south, first on railroads and then over the road, people got in their buggies, brought a picnic lunch, and went along to watch. I don't think it's really bright, but anyway, they thought, oh, this will be the chance of a lifetime. We'll see the battle that ended the Civil War. And in fact, the Union Army does quite well at the beginning. But one brigade commander, I don't know if he's a colonel or brigadier general or what yet, by the name of Thomas Jackson, manages to keep his brigade from backing down in front of the Union forces. That's where he gets the nickname Stonewall, because his unit stood like an old stone wall and didn't back down. Stonewall Jackson kind of changes the day, and the Union forces are thrown into disarray, and they actually start to run. And they'll head all the way back up to Washington, D.C., you can imagine the people with their buggies and their picnic lunches going, "Wait for me!" As they went back. And people in Washington were afraid that the Southern Army was just going to charge right into Washington, D.C. But the Southern Army was no more ready to fight than the Union Army was, so they just stayed where they were, considered themselves lucky. Pretty quickly you'll see the leadership of both armies start to change a little bit, in as much as they'll start identifying the guys that can fight and the guys that couldn't. What's the significance of Bull Run? Suddenly everybody's eyes were opened up and they realized this war is not going to be over in an afternoon, or maybe not a lot of afternoons. And the other thing they realized was this wasn't one of these things like a toy soldiers game. People are going to die in this war. Union losses, they lost 460 killed. If you compare that to some other major war battles, that was nothing. They lost a total of about 1,100 wounded, about 1,300 missing. Some of them became POWs perhaps, some of them just skedaddled and went to hide somewhere. The South lost 387 killed, about 1,500, almost 1,600 wounded, and a few missing. Remember, they're fighting on their own home ground. Just as a side note, and this picture happened many years later, happened about 2 years later, but these are the generals. This is probably the only war, the last war at least, in which the President of the United States actually got out on the battlefield. And Abraham Lincoln micromanaged this war in the Eastern Front, and more or less micromanaged it through his senior general, first Winfield Scott, then a general named Halleck, on the Western Front, by keeping as many sources of information as he had. Remember, they had no radios. They did have telegraph if there was a line between you and the front. But he's watching his generals to see if they're doing what needed to be done. And in the case of the Army of the Potomac, they didn't. General McDowell, that had the debacle at Bull Run, is going to get fired pretty quickly. He's going to be replaced by General McClellan. Lincoln will get tired of him. In about a year, he's going to fire him. General Burnside will take over. He does not do well. He lasts for about 3 months. General Burnside gets fired. General Hooker takes over. General Hooker is going to get fired when he falls apart after suffering a terrible defeat. And finally, we'll have General George Meade, who will be the general that wins the Battle of Gettysburg, and we'll talk about that later. The whole point I'm making is Abraham Lincoln, that's a picture of him sitting in a tent on the battlefield with the commanding general telling him, "Get your act together." I know the generals hated for him to visit. Those are pictures of the generals that I just named. Out west, the senior general was the guy in the lower left-hand corner, General Halleck. He will replace Winfield Scott as the general-in-chief when Winfield Scott passes away. Of course, Ulysses S. Grant is a strange story himself. He wasn't a general at the beginning of the war. In fact, he wasn't in the Army at the beginning of the war. He left the Army as a major. He had personal problems. Some people said he drank too much, but his big problem was he was in debt. And he couldn't pay his bills, and that was a no-no for military officers. So he resigned his commission, tried to raise money by going into business, was not very successful. When the war, he was, by the way, he did a good job, and people knew it in the Mexican-American War. But he's a civilian. When the war starts, he starts bombarding Washington with requests, "Let me join the Army again," and nobody wanted him. We don't want that guy. His reputation kind of went really sour. I mean, he wasn't really a drunk, but he did suffer from depression and he would get drunk. And this reputation grew and grew and grew. So everyone said, he's a drunk. We don't want him in the Army. So he went up into Illinois to the governor and said, the governor of Illinois was trying to organize his militia so they could contribute, and it was like herding cats, and he was kind of in despair about, will this ever get organized? And General Grant, at that time, I guess he was still he used the title major, went to the governor of Illinois and said, let me help. And he got the Illinois militia organized, got it, eventually it will be incorporated into the Union Army. Along the way, the governor makes him a colonel, and then, I'm pretty sure, yeah, it was the governor of Illinois that made him a brigadier general too, and he's incorporated into the Union Army, and he holds his rank as a brigadier general of the reserves in the Union Army. General Fremont, we've heard of before, that's the same Fremont that captured California, or captured Sonoma, California, and was kind of a self-advertiser. He's going to be a self-advertiser in this war. He's going to get fired. General Sherman, we'll hear about later. General Sheridan will be General Grant's cavalryman. General Halleck, who's General Grant's boss, is going to get promoted upstairs. Talk about that. That's a message. You can read it at your own time. William Tecumseh Sherman was not on active duty in the Army, and he was the superintendent of the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy. Later on, it changed its name to LSU because he's a military officer, and this was to provide also military training for people. And he wrote this letter telling the people of the South, you are absolutely insane to go to war with the Union. They can make a steam engine, they can make a locomotive, they can make a railway car. You guys can't even make a pair of shoes or a yard of cloth. You don't even have a textile mill. How do you think you're going to win? You're bound to fail. Don't do this. And then he left and rejoined the Army. Early on in the war, it's November 1861, no major battles. They're still kind of positioning, getting control of their cities, seaports and things like that. The Union's already got a pretty good blockade on all the seaports of the South. The South tries to send 2 diplomats over to Europe to get recognition from Britain and from France and maybe some other countries, recognition and maybe even help. James Mason and John Slidell. Slidell, you may remember, he's the guy that President Polk sent down to Mexico to try and buy California and New Mexico, and that failed, and then the war started. They went by a Confederate blockade runner, and I think they went to Bermuda, and then they boarded a British ship, a merchant ship, not a warship, that was headed for England. And there was a naval officer who was told to catch them, who missed them until they got on the British ship. Then he found out they were on the British ship, so he went and stopped the British ship and took them off the ship, which was a violation of, well, we weren't at war with Britain, so, you know, you couldn't touch British ships, although they did to us before the War of 1812. And it almost brought England into war against the United States, which would have been a disaster. Finally, Lincoln and his diplomats found a way to back down, and they gave these 2 men back to the British. And we didn't go to war with England. But it was kind of a dangerous event. There was a Navy officer who really wanted to capture those guys and just went one step too far. He crossed the line. Early battle in March of 1862 that demonstrates to us how much the blockades worried the South. When the North left Norfolk, Virginia, when they pulled troops out of there, out of the naval yards, they took all the ships with them. There was one ship they couldn't bring with them because it didn't have any mast to it. There was no way to take it north. So they set it on fire to keep the South from capturing it. It only burned down to the water line. And when the Southern troops came in and took over the shipyard, they took this hulk, they chopped away the burned wood on the top, and they built a new top to the ship. They also, it was steam powered. It was one of the ships that was part steam powered and part sail powered. And they built a roof on it made out of steel or iron. Made it pretty top heavy, but they called it, the name of the ship was the Merrimack. There's a painting of the Merrimack after it was rebuilt. I give you a better, this is a photograph of another ship that was like the Merrimack. That was the Atlanta. Notice the guns, most of the guns are pointing out the side the way they do in a regular wooden ship. Notice the long beak on it. The purpose of that beak, instead of trying to just bounce cannonballs off a ship, the purpose of that beak was they'd just get up ahead of steam and just ram the ship. Then back up and let it sink. Stick a hole in it with the beak on their ship. Now, the first ship that they had like that was the Merrimack, which they renamed the Virginia. And in March of I'm trying to look for maps. There's Hampton Roads. That's the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. In March of 1882, the Virginia is going to come out and it's going to start sinking Union ships. Fairly successful. It did some severe damage, and they thought, this is how to win the war, until the following day the Union brought out this ship. They were just practicing with it, just had it made. It's called the Monitor. It's almost all underwater, and it's got one revolutionary thing. It's a steam-driven ship, no sails or masts. The revolutionary thing, aside from the form of the ship, it was all metal. The Merrimack or the Virginia was only metal on top of the waterline. This ship had a turret. This is one of the first naval ships anywhere with a rotating turret and two big guns on it. So you didn't have to maneuver your ship around to shoot at somebody, you just rotated the turret. They're going to get into it. I always use my example of what it must have been like for the people on those two ships. Get inside a trash can and let one of your friends take a baseball bat and just whack that trash can for about an hour. That's what it was like inside those ironclad ships. The long and short of it was that the Virginia was damaged because they had the lower part of the ship was wood, and every time the ship fired a broadside, it would rock the ship up and expose that wooden bottom, and the Merrimack put some cannonballs into the wooden bottom of the ship. But it also did damage to the Monitor. That was that picture I flashed at you before. That's after the end of the battle, the Monitor. Notice the big dents in the turret? You notice there's only one gun pointing out. The other gun was damaged. So they fought all day long. And at the end of the day, they withdrew. There was a draw. They had to burn the Confederate Navy had to burn the Merrimack or the Virginia because it had been damaged below the waterline. When it rocked up, they shot at it and hit the wood and did damage, and they didn't want the Union to be able to capture it. So they destroyed it. The Monitor, though, went home, got repaired, and the Union government started building more of them. And for up until almost the 1900s, it was a really special kind of ship. They even used them as far east as the Philippines. A lot of people didn't think they could get it to go that far without sinking it in the high seas. Anyway, that's where the battle was fought. And what the battle told us was that the South really, really was already suffering from being blockaded, and they were desperate to find a way to break the blockade. Now, that picture you're looking at there is Major General Benjamin Butler. He was kind of a political general. I don't think he was all that bad, but he certainly wasn't a lifelong fighting man. He's going to be in charge of New Orleans starting from the beginning of May in 1862, because the Union Navy will sail up the Mississippi and take New Orleans. I think it was an admiral named Porter, but I might be wrong. And Butler then will bring army in there and occupy New Orleans. Now they've got the door closed on the Mississippi River. Now if they want to control the Mississippi, they're going to have to go up and control it. Out west, our non-officer, the guy that couldn't get back in the Union officer, U.S. Grant, is now back in the Union Army, and he's going to take a force and capture the two northernmost Confederate forts. One's called Fort Henry. He'll capture that in February of 1862. And then a couple weeks later, he's going to go and capture Fort Donelson. That was a little bit harder of a nut to crack, but he'll take Fort Donelson as well by using floating guns, by using Navy little gunboats and things like that. And basically, in the case of Fort Donelson, he besieged them so they couldn't get in or out. When Fort Donelson was in really bad straits and they realized that they were about to be captured or whatever, the general in command of Fort Donelson, I can't remember if it was General Pillow or it was another guy, but sent a note out to Grant. And see, Grant and he knew each other. They were classmates at West Point. So he sent him a note out and said, "What terms will you give me?" And Grant sent him a note back and said, "Unconditional surrender." And he got the nickname of, because his name was Ulysses Simpson Grant, his initials were U.S., so they started calling him Unconditional Surrender Grant. And he was kind of that kind of guy anyway. So he takes those two forts. Now, if you look at this map, it's a little confusing, but right here is the Tennessee River. Can you see that arrow? So it goes into the Mississippi, but it flows north, not south. And what Grant's going to do is, since using these Navy boats and paddle wheelers and things like that worked out for him at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, he's going to take them and move his army. The Army of the Tennessee was the name of that army. Remember, I told you the Union tended to name things after physical features on the map. He's going to go down because the Union wants to capture the railhead at a city called Corinth, Mississippi, in the northeastern corner of Mississippi. It was really important strategically because there are railroads east and west, and some north and south all passed through that town. It wasn't very well defended, but the Southerners are going to send their best general, Albert Sidney Johnson, who's been fighting up in the direction of Nashville, Tennessee. He's going to come roaring down to Corinth to protect Corinth. Grant's going to go down to a place called Pitt's Landing. He's going to put his army ashore. They're not very well organized, probably not his fault, in large part because the different officers commanding the different units didn't like following Grant's orders, because he was that guy with the reputation, he was a drunk guy, who cares about him, etc. I'm smarter than him. So it was like herding cats for him too. One guy that stayed loyal to him was William Tecumseh Sherman. And they get their butts whipped one whole day. It's incredible casualties. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but it was the worst day in the war so far. And it looked like he was going to be pushed back into the Tennessee River, but they held along a road that was a sunken road that gave them kind of a rampart to hide behind, to fire out at. And when the sun went down, It wasn't over with, so everybody dug in on both sides. And then a really bad thing's gonna happen to the South. General Johnson, Albert Sidney Johnson, is gonna go out and check his positions along the lines, and he's going to be shot. A whole bunch of people are shot. I can't remember if it was an ambush or what. He didn't realize it, and he didn't feel that he was shot that badly, but the minie ball that went into his leg cut through his pulmonary artery, and he died in about a minute. He died sitting on his horse, fell off dead. Yeah, two places you don't want to be wounded in. One's the pulmonary artery, and the other's the carotid arteries. And we won't get into details, but I've seen a guy die from being shot through the carotid arteries, and he was dead standing on his feet. So they've lost their commanding general, the brightest star in the Southern leadership. General Beauregard is the deputy commander, but he's way, way back in the rear, which is where the deputies usually were supposed to be, and he can't pass through all these units in the middle of the night because he'll get shot too. So he sent messengers up to tell everyone, dig in, have everybody ready. The minute, at the crack of dawn, we will attack again, and we're going to push them into the Tennessee River. On the Union side, there was a lot of disagreement and bickering amongst the senior officers. William Tecumseh Sherman finds General Grant kind of standing by himself next to his tent, telling him, boy, that was a disaster. What are we going to do now? And General Grant just looks at him, lights a cigar, takes a couple puffs on the stogie, and said, we'll win tomorrow. That was the end of that discussion. What neither them nor the Southern guys realized was that Grant was about to be joined by another Army unit with almost 20,000 more men. That'll bring his numbers up to almost 70,000. That general also doesn't like to follow the orders of Grant, even though Grant was now senior to him. And so they fight side by side, but they don't coordinate, but it doesn't matter. On the next day, they're going to drive the Confederate troops off the battlefield. They're going to evacuate the city of Corinth. The Union will move into Corinth. Now, this was the deadliest battle in the Civil War up until that day. General Halleck, who never had any respect for General Grant, wants to fire him, but the way to fire him without having to go through the whole process, he's going to promote him out of command of his army. He'll make him his overall deputy commander with no troops under him. A lot of people are howling for Grant's scalp, even though he eventually won this battle. They thought he got too many people killed off. He's a butcher, or he's an idiot, or whatever, except for one man. When he gets word that they're thinking about firing Grant, this one man says, I can't spare Grant. He fights. He was a man who was having trouble persuading his other generals to fight. And his name, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. And it's always good to have the president on your side. So what eventually happens, Grant got this job where he wasn't in command of anybody, and he got kind of promoted out of his job. And what Lincoln does is he promotes General Halleck up to General-in-Chief, brings him to Washington, and now Grant's the senior man there. So he's back in charge without anybody getting fired. That's the way the politicians did it. Those are the guys involved in this battle. Albert Sidney Johnson, of course, died in the battle. Beauregard takes over. Grant and Don Carlos Buell, who didn't like each other. Buell didn't like him because he kind of came in the back door into the army. Buell thought he should be in charge, but he had a smaller army. They're going to clean out Corinth, and Grant is now going to be in charge of an army that's made up of Don Carlos Buell's army plus Grant's Army of Tennessee. They'll call it the Army of the Mississippi. And now Grant's job is to come down and help regain control of the Mississippi River. is going to take a number of forts, but the big problem is a city along the banks of the Mississippi that's high up over the water, that's well occupied by Southern troops. It's called Vicksburg. And it blocks that river. It keeps the Union from being able to sail their Navy all the way up the river. So the Unions put boats in up around Cairo, Illinois, and floated them down. They're using some paddle wheelers, whatever they've got. But Vicksburg is going to be a tough nut to crack. That'll be what Grant's job is going to be for a while. And he's like a bulldog about it. He tries all sorts of different methods. He tries digging canals up to the city. He tries coming from both sides. He tries all sorts of things. Finally, he'll figure out what he has to do to get Vicksburg. And what he has to do to get Vicksburg, and we're a little ahead of ourselves, we're not there yet. What he has to do to get Vicksburg is, instead of attacking Vicksburg, he's going to attack all the railroads and towns around Vicksburg, so that Vicksburg is eventually isolated and they begin to starve. Now, let's go back east. Abraham Lincoln is taking grief from the newspapers. Why haven't you freed the slaves yet? What is your policy? And it kind of bothers Lincoln. He reads Horace Greeley, very influential newspaper owner. Later on will be a candidate for president himself. The New York Tribune. And President Lincoln comes back with this simplified answer. As to the policy, quote, I seem to be pursuing, those are Greeley's words, as you say, I've not meant to leave anyone in doubt. I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way under the Constitution. The sooner national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be to the Union as it was. Didn't say a word about slavery there, did he? I would save the Union as number one objective. You can't free any slaves if you don't control the territory. His real reason for dragging his feet about emancipating was there were still 4 states that were slave states who had not left the Union. And they were located in areas that he needed to be able to control. He didn't want them joining the other side. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. I know on this map they also have West Virginia. West Virginia didn't exist yet. It was still part of Virginia. General McClellan's actually going to fight. Abraham Lincoln, the Northerners called it the Battle of Antietam because there was a creek there named that. The Southerners called it the Battle of Sharpsburg because it's near a little town called Sharpsburg. Happens in September of 1862. Now, to preface this whole story, remember the Southern strategy. They wanted to make the North not want to fight anymore. And Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis decided to do an end run around all the Union forces near Washington, D.C., force the Union forces all to have to shift around to protect Washington, head up into Maryland. Who knows how far north they could go. If nothing else, shock the people up there into wanting to quit. Meantime, Lincoln's pushing McClellan, when are you going to attack? We need to get to Richmond, for heaven's sakes, it's only 90 miles south. Why can't we get there? Now, as Robert E. Lee goes around Washington, D.C., he's being kind of trailed by the Union Army. They're kind of shifting sideways to keep Washington covered. One of Robert E. Lee's officers, one of his messengers, loses a bag that's got a big map with where all of his forces are and where he's planning to send them. It falls into the hands of the Union Army. They take it to General McClellan and say, General, now we can attack. We know everything is. We can take them apart one at a time, however we want. And General McClellan continued to drag his feet, getting organized and this and that. He almost had an insurrection. His generals almost revolted against him. Finally, he decides to go to battle. It's the Battle of Antietam or the Battle of Sharpsburg, depending on where you were born. The bloodiest battle in the entire Civil War. I got to say that carefully. Yeah, the bloodiest battle. It's the bloodiest day in the entire Civil War. Put it that way. It's only going to last for part of one day. Tactically, it's a tie. It's a draw. They fought to a draw. They had similar. Actually, the Union Army lost 2,000 more men. But at the end of the day, Robert E. Lee had to withdraw back to the south because he'd stretched his supply line so far. And so the Union could claim it as a victory because they were the last man standing. Abraham Lincoln's going to seize on this. He really didn't think it was a victory, but he's going to seize on this. And since General McClellan claims it's a victory, let's accept it as such. Congratulations, General McClellan. We've now had a giant victory because there was something he wanted to do. He wanted to announce the emancipation of the slaves. But we needed a victory, a real victory, before he could do that. So he's going to seize upon this as a victory. He's going to tell his cabinet, I'm about to announce, make a proclamation of emancipation. And eventually he's going to do that. I can't remember the date. On the 22nd of September, he warns his cabinet of what he's about to do. Now the cabinet had told him, you got to go slow on this until you win some victories. But now he's telling the cabinet, I'm doing this. And basically, he says that he would order the emancipation of all slaves. Listen to the words. Listen carefully. Of all slaves in any state that did not end its rebellion against the Union by the first day of January, 1863. Think about where he didn't emancipate the slaves. In the states that had never left the Union, he didn't emancipate them. He didn't emancipate the slaves that were left over in Washington, D.C. All he did was emancipate the slaves in the southern states that were still in rebellion. Practically speaking, since he didn't control the southern states that were still in rebellion, how many slaves did he emancipate? None. Now, I've said over and over again, this is one of the most brilliant strategic politicians in our history. So he knew damn well he hadn't freed any slaves. Why did he make this proclamation? Well, one of it was to get people like William Lloyd Garrison and the newspaper people and all that off his back for a while. Another reason was to cause the South to be confused and upset because they didn't know if their slaves were considering themselves free or what. But there was a major reason, and it all has to do with the Southern strategy. The Southern strategy was drag this war out until we can get our European friends to come into the war on our side, either negotiating or actually military assistance. When Abraham Lincoln made the Emancipation Proclamation, basically, you could read between the lines this. This war is about slavery. Who's that an announcement to? It's not just to the South and to the United States. It's to the whole world, and they heard it. Even back then, when the President of the United States said something like that, the whole world heard him. Now, yes, the royal leaders of England, the Emperor of France, they all tended to favor the South. The French Emperor actually proposed to the British, why don't we get together in this and go help the South out? The British kind of dragged their feet. But now, the whole world's been put on notice. This war is about slavery. And guess what? the leaders of France and England dared not help the South because the people of France and England didn't like slavery. And so if you go against the will of your people, you're likely not to be the king or the dictator or anything else anymore. That, in fact, the emancipation, in fact, cut off the main part of European aid to the South. So now they're truly isolated. It was an incredibly brilliant strategic move. No, it didn't free any slaves. It wasn't what eventually freed the slaves, but it certainly helped win the war. There, by the way, is that picture I showed you before. That's somewhere near the battlefield at Antietam. After the fighting was over, Abraham Lincoln rides out there to visit with General McClellan, saying, "You tell me you defeated the Southern Army. Why didn't you follow them and finish them off? What are you doing sitting here?" And McClellan is saying, "Well, we suffered a lot of damage. We're restocking our ammunition, etc., etc." And then began this exchange of little notes in between the President of the United States and this general every week. "Well, what's progress? We making any progress towards the South yet?" "No, not yet, because of this reason, that reason, the other." Finally, Lincoln sends him a note. "Major General McClellan, I have read your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigues them so much?" You know, you can read between the lines. Get off your butt and go fight. And about a month later, not even a month later, Abraham Lincoln fires General McClellan, relieves him from command of the Union Army, and puts General Ambrose Burnside in charge. Burnside's, I guess he was a halfway decent general. He fought one battle, the Battle of Fredericksburg, got his butt whipped by the South. The only thing that we remember Ambrose Burnside about has nothing to do with fighting. What would you imagine? It's a word that came into use because of Ambrose Burnside. What is the word? What's your guess? Look at the picture of him. And it's a play on his name. Sideburns. They started calling that facial hair under your ears sideburns, just because of Ambrose Burnside. That's about all he did that was any good. He's going to last for 3 months, he's going to get fired. And the Emancipation Proclamation will come into effect on the first day of January, 1863. There goes Burnside. Joseph Hooker was known to be an aggressive general. He puts him in command of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker's up to it as far as being aggressive, but he's not up to it as far as mentally. I don't mean he was stupid. I mean, he had trouble handling a giant army like that. He's going to fight one battle. It will be a dreadful defeat. And then when he's called upon to fight another battle, he's going to kind of fall apart and be replaced. Lincoln always looking over his shoulder. The draft in March of 1863. Now, after Fort Sumter, Abraham Lincoln goes out and asks for authorization to get 400,000 new soldiers. After, I guess it wasn't Sumter, it was after the Battle of Bull Run. The South raises 500,000 more soldiers. Their problem is, in the long run, they're going to have trouble recruiting because they don't have that high a population. Finally, in the beginning of 1863, the government decides they need more soldiers, and they authorize our very first draft. Men between the ages of 20 and 45 will have to register. Over the entire course of the war, we're going to get about 162,000 men through the draft, so it wasn't that big. And men could buy their way out of the draft by buying a substitute. I think the going price is about $300. Okay, April and May of 1863. Robert E. Lee in his glory, his greatest victory, General Hooker coming south, being pushed along by Abraham Lincoln, loses control of his forces, fights the Battle of Chancellorsville, when Robert E. Lee takes an enormous gamble, because the rule of thumb was never separate your forces. He's going to split his army into two pieces. He's going to set up a dummy force on one side, and he's going to try and flank the Union Army, go around them, to attack them from the side of the rear. His best general, Stonewall Jackson, will lead that move. And they are successful. They drive the Union Army back. It's going to fall into disarray. Eventually Hooker will have control of them, but they have to retreat. A great victory for Robert E. Lee, because it leaves the entire Union Army kind of stuck over there on the other side of the, I think that's the Rappahannock, the Rapidan or the Rappahannock. It's the Rappahannock. And Robert E. Lee is going to say, hey, the door's open, I can go north again. There's no way they can catch up with me. And so he's going to, pretty quickly, send his troops to the north. Once again, what are they after? A political victory. And also they have another problem, because the Bulldog out west is closing in on Vicksburg. U.S. Grant has finally got to the point where he's starving Vicksburg out, and Vicksburg is oh so important to the Confederacy. And one of the hopes that Robert E. Lee has, if I go far enough and deep enough into the north, they'll have to bring their army back to protect the north. That didn't happen. Robert E. Lee is going to meet up with General Hooker, is going to fall apart. He has to back up, and he's trying to follow Robert E. Lee as Robert E. Lee goes north with the entire Army of Northern Virginia. He's going to get to Maryland, cross out of Maryland into Pennsylvania. He's going to come to a little seminary town called Gettysburg, and he's going to bump into the Union Army. And we'll talk about Gettysburg and Vicksburg and all of that next time around. Thank you very much.